Your toddler is holding a toy at the playground and another child wants it. And before you have even thought about it, the words are already out: share with your friend, be kind. And your child looks at you with that face, the one that is not quite defiance and not quite sadness but somewhere in between, and they hand it over. And you think, good. That is the lesson. That is kindness. Except developmental psychology has now spent decades studying exactly what is being learned in that moment. And it is not kindness. There is a way to raise a child who genuinely, willingly shares without ever forcing it. And I am going to show you exactly what that looks like. Before we get to what works, 3 things parents do that actively make this worse. First, the forced handover, taking the toy from your child's hands and giving it to another child. Research shows this does not teach generosity. It teaches that possession is unsafe and that adults override their autonomy. Second, the shame response, saying things like "do not be selfish" or "why can you not be kind like your friend?" Shame does not build prosocial behaviour. It builds anxiety and resentment around sharing situations. Third, the false equivalence, telling a toddler that sharing means giving something away now and getting it back later. A child under 4 does not have the neurological capacity to delay gratification in that way. You are asking for a developmental skill they do not possess yet. None of these approaches fail because you are doing it wrong. They fail because they are asking the wrong brain to do the wrong thing. The first solution is replacing the word sharing entirely with turn-taking, and this is not a semantic trick. It is a neurologically precise distinction that changes everything about how the interaction lands in a toddler's brain. Sharing, as children understand it, means giving something up permanently or indefinitely. Turn-taking means your thing comes back to you. It has a defined end. Research from developmental psychologist Dr. Kristen Lagatuta at the University of California, Davis shows that toddlers as young as 2.5 can understand and participate in turn-taking when it is framed as "you have it now and then Noah has it," because the concept of sequence is accessible to them, where the concept of relinquishing ownership is not. The practical language is simple and specific. Instead of "share with your friend," say, "Noah has it right now and when he is finished it comes back to you." Or, "You can have the next turn, let us count to 20 together." What you are doing is replacing a demand for an impossible developmental skill with an invitation to practice a real one. The second solution is narrating ownership before conflict arrives, and this is the move that prevents most playground arguments before they begin. Research on prosocial development consistently shows that children who have a clear, validated sense of their own ownership, who know that their things are their things and that adults will protect that rather than override it, are measurably more willing to share voluntarily than children whose ownership is routinely dismissed. The language during calm moments sounds like this: "That is your truck, you decide what happens with it." Or before a playdate, "Some of your toys are yours to keep today and we can put them away, and some toys can be for sharing. Which ones do you want to choose for sharing?" This is not permissiveness. This is autonomy, and autonomy is the neurological precondition for genuine generosity. A child who feels safe in their ownership does not cling to every object defensively. They can afford to be generous because nothing feels under threat. The third solution is modeling generosity without commanding it, and this is where the research gets particularly clear. Studies from the Yale Infant Cognition Center and from Dr. Felix Warneken at the University of Michigan show that children are born with prosocial impulses, genuine desires to help and to give, from as early as 14 months. What extinguishes those impulses is not a failure to be taught sharing. It is repeated experiences of sharing as an external demand rather than an internal choice. When you model generosity, offering a bite of your food unprompted, giving something to someone else in your child's presence and naming what you are doing, offering to help someone without being asked, you are feeding the prosocial circuitry that was already there. Say it out loud: "I am going to give some of my coffee cake to Dad because I want him to have some too." That narrated voluntary generosity lands in a toddler's brain as data about how humans relate to each other. It does not need to be commanded. It needs to be seen. The fourth solution is adjusting your expectations to match the developmental window, because much of the distress around toddler sharing comes from expecting a capacity the brain has not built yet. The prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for impulse control, perspective taking, and the ability to delay gratification in service of a social relationship, is not sufficiently developed for genuine voluntary sharing in most children until around age 3 to 4, and for some children closer to 5 or 6. This does not mean doing nothing until then. It means measuring success differently. A 2-year-old who allows another child to play nearby without distress is displaying prosocial behaviour. A 3-year-old who hands something over after hesitation rather than a meltdown is making significant developmental progress. A 4-year-old who offers a turn unprompted is demonstrating genuine emerging generosity. When parents in the US, UK, and Canada are told their 2-year-old needs to learn to share by the nursery or daycare, they are often being held to a milestone that the developmental literature does not support at that age. The research does not say your child is unkind. It says they are too. Turn-taking gives children the concept of sequence. Ownership narration gives them the safety to be generous. Modeled generosity gives them the data for how kind people behave. And adjusted expectations give them the time to actually grow. None of these require a perfect parent. They require a slightly better informed one. And here is the part that the forced sharing culture never produces: a child who genuinely wants to give. Not because an adult is watching. Not because they are afraid of being called selfish. But because they have been shown, in hundreds of small moments, that generosity is what the people they love and admire do when they want to. That is the only version worth building. The turn-taking language does not take longer than share with your friend. The ownership narration takes 30 seconds before a playdate. The modeled generosity happens in the moments of daily life you are already living. None of this is extra work. It is the same effort pointed in a direction the research supports. The child you are raising is not unkind. They are developing. Kindness at this age is not a trait that is present or absent. It is a capacity that is being built, interaction by interaction, in the spaces between the commands. Research from Dr. Joan Grusek at the University of Toronto, one of the leading researchers in prosocial development, is consistent across decades of study. Children raised in environments where generosity is modeled, where autonomy is respected, and where compliance is not confused with character, show measurably higher rates of voluntary prosocial behavior across childhood and into adolescence. The goal was never a child who hands things over on command. The goal was always a child who looks at someone else and wants them to have something good. Those two things are not the same goal. And only one of them is built by force. Every time you use turn-taking language instead of share, you are giving your child's brain a sequence it can actually hold. Every time you narrate ownership, you are building the safety that makes generosity possible. Every time you model giving without being asked, you are feeding a prosocial impulse that arrived with your child before you taught them anything. And every time you resist the pressure of other parents watching, and choose the turn-taking frame over the forced handover, you are doing something that feels small and uncomfortable in the moment and builds something real over time. The kindness you wanted to teach was always in there. You were just handed the wrong tool to reach it. If you have ever stood at a playground in the rain, feeling the eyes of other parents on you while your toddler refused to hand over a truck, and wondered what it says about you or about them, I want you to hear this. It said nothing about either of you. It said your child has a 2-year-old brain that is working exactly as designed. The turn-taking, the ownership narration, the modeled generosity, the adjusted expectations, none of these require a perfect parent. They require a slightly more informed one. And today you are that. Next week we are going into why your baby's language is already falling behind, and how your phone is part of the reason. If today felt useful, that one is going to feel like a relief. Subscribe so you are there when it goes up. Little minds, brave parents. Take care and we'll see you soon.